proximity, duration, and potency. Hi, I'm Darren Wright from 12 Church, where we're seeking to figure out how to be disciples who make disciples in this time and place. I was listening to the Kansas City Underground podcast recently, episode 203, where they were talking with Roy Moran, and 3 words were mentioned that have stuck with me. I've been mulling on since I first heard them in relation to evangelism and disciple making. And those words are proximity, duration, and potency. The actual quote that brought those words forward was this: "The idea of the gospel moving or replicating, just like a virus replicates, takes a certain number of functions. You've got to have proximity, duration, potency. You've got to have these 3 things that are heading together." And part of the challenge is that in the local church, a lot of times, because people have to come to church and are often caught up in the activities of the church, they are pulled out of the larger culture, and that proximity is broken. And they pointed out in the podcast that for proximity and duration and potency to happen in our disciple making, it requires different structures and different ways for leaders to think. And so since I heard that quote, since I heard that podcast, I've been thinking a lot about those 3 words as it relates to evangelism and disciple making. Now, we do know that evangelism is a part of disciple making. We're not talking here about evangelism pre-conversion, discipleship post-conversion. We're talking about the umbrella term disciple making that includes evangelism pre-conversion and further disciple making after conversion. But sometimes it's helpful to kind of pull them apart and talk about pre-conversion and post-conversion. And that's what I'd like to do here for a few minutes as we talk about proximity, duration, and potency. Thinking pre-conversion, thinking about evangelism, here's how those 3 words have kind of stirred my thinking. When I hear the word proximity in relation to evangelism, I think right away of the salt and light passages. The salt can't lose its saltiness. The light can't be hidden. There needs to be this proximity. If there's no contact, there is no impact. This highlights the fact that evangelism is, by nature, incarnational. It points out that proclaiming the gospel has a high relational component, not just a distant, impersonal proclamation component. When we think about evangelism, alongside that word duration, we recognize that evangelism, by its nature, often takes time. It's not just a one-off presentation, one and done. It is an ongoing process many times to bring a person to the place of repenting and believing and following Jesus. I'm challenged from time to time by people who think that the gospel shouldn't really have any process to it, that you should just share the gospel with someone every time, the first time you meet them, and just get her done, because you might not meet them again and they might pass away. But my reaction to that is that you must live in a different context than I do. I was trained with evangelism explosion and the 4 spiritual laws, and in a context many years ago where we could assume that most people had a basic understanding of the Christian story. That's not the case anymore, at least not where I live. And at the same time, where the gospel is going into new areas in a pioneering way, it's also the case there. There is no context for people to hear the story. There needs to be some time taken, both relationally and to fill out the whole story of God. I agree that sometimes we may be led by the Spirit to go for it right now and share the gospel and call for response. But in my experience, as someone who is totally prepared to do that, in most cases, it's about building a relationship and then over time sharing the gospel, sharing your story, sharing God's story in the context of that ongoing relationship. When we talk about potency in the context of evangelism, we're not talking here about the potency of the gospel. The potency of the gospel is without question. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. The potency of the gospel message holds. In fact, I have a story on file. I found it. I dug up the original source. It's in this book, Love, Acceptance, and Forgiveness by Jerry Cook. The book was published in the late 70s. But there's a story in here that really illustrates the potency of the basic gospel message. Let me read it for you. It says, "The gospel is so simple that even a non-Christian can lead another person to Christ. I've known it to happen. A man who's been a member of our church for a number of years was a former drug pusher. He was led to Christ in a free love commune in downtown Portland. A girl from a Spokane commune and this guy were smoking dope together. One day he said to her, "I'd like to be free of this dope." She was not a Christian, but she'd been raised in a Christian home. She said to him, "I know how you can do that. If you trusted in Jesus as your Savior, he would deliver you." He said, "What? What does that all mean?" She said, "I'm not going to tell you." "Why not?" "Because then you'll take off and be a Christian. I won't see you anymore." He kept prodding her until finally she said, "All right, I'll tell you." She quoted John 3:16 and explained to him how to be saved. He went into the other room, prayed to receive Christ, and was delivered. He walked out of that place and never went back. She stayed, and as far as I know, is not a Christian to this day. This girl wasn't saved, didn't want to be saved, didn't want him to be saved, yet she was able to tell the way of salvation, and the power of the gospel saved this man. You see, the power is in the gospel, not in the presentation or the delivery. So the gospel itself has potency. So when I think of potency in relation to evangelism, I'm thinking about us. The potency of our character, the potency of our person. Are we operating in the flesh, or are we operating in the Spirit? Are we in a place where we can receive Spirit-directed insights to ask questions and make statements that will cut to the core of the person? Are we in a place where we're prepared to pray for their healing and minister deliverance to them? Is there potency in us? Are we actually filled at that moment with the Spirit? That's what I think of when I think of potency in evangelism. The gospel message is potent. Are we in a place where that message can flow through us in its full potency? So for me, those three words in relation to evangelism give me a lot to think about and a lot to evaluate. And then when we think about them in the context of post-conversion disciple making, I think these three words also challenge us and give us an avenue for self-evaluation. When I think of proximity in disciple making, really it recognizes the fact that disciple making takes place in relationship, that disciples make disciples by being in relationship with them. Disciple making is an apprenticeship. It is a teacher-student. It is a follower. We have the example of Jesus with his disciples. There was proximity. He said, "Follow me, come and be with me, stay with me." And that's what they did, and that's how those disciples were made. Many committed Christians, faithful Christians, have never moved into mission or into disciple making because they've never had proximity to a disciple maker. Ultimately, the student becomes like their teacher. If the teacher is a disciple maker, the student will become a disciple maker. If they are not, they may become very biblically literate and be, quote, good Christians, but they may never move into active, effective mission. There needs to be proximity. And of course, this implies duration. That relationship takes time. Disciple making takes time. It takes time to see the example and respond and live through some different variables of life and learn how to handle different contingencies that come at us as we move out into mission. Someone who's walked that path before can really help us along the way. There are some predictable obstacles. One of the big challenges is integrating mission into our life and not seeing our life in all these compartments with mission and disciple making as just one category, but making it the umbrella category. Making living on mission with Jesus the thing we do, and everything else kind of is under that and feeds into it. It's really helpful if that can be modeled for us. A mentor, disciple maker, models it for us, helps us walk through some landmines, and equips us then to model it and pass it on to others. When I think of potency in relation to disciple making, it raises these questions for me. Am I actually living on mission? Is it valid and proper for me to say, as Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ? Am I modeling that integrated versus fragmented way of living? Are disciples actually being made? And a question I find incredibly challenging. If I make disciples and they are just like me, will the kingdom be advancing? Proximity, duration, and potency. Three excellent words to evaluate and motivate our evangelism and disciple making.